West Springfield, Massachusetts, not part of Springfield, an independent community today, a city, formerly a town, but once upon a time, part of the original Pension Colony, established just north of Hartford as a trading post, really, on the Connecticut River, where two great tributaries, the Chicopee and the Westfield, enter the river. The colony of Springfield was originally established on this side of the river until the native people, known as the Agawam, asked them to move it across the river because the pigs and the cattle and the sheep were getting into their maize, what we call corn. I'm standing in front of the first church. Well, the site of the first church, which burned. I think the year was 1800 when it burned. And this church wasn't built until right around 1900. That's a story in itself to tell. But the whole point is, the fact that West Springfield got a first church in the year 1693 was the first step on West Springfield's road to independence from Springfield. The story of West Springfield becoming independent of its mother community, Springfield, is an interesting one, and that is going to be the topic of today's Fishing Historic Places episode. What we're going to do to tell the rest of the story is go to the river, the Connecticut River, where the secret to that church being located right there on the site of the original first church, or first parish church, begins. We are walking down to the shore of the Connecticut River here, using the Bondi's Island boat ramp, a particularly bad boat ramp in that the river is really shallow here and you're going to have a heck of a time trying to launch a boat unless the water's really high. It's not really high now. It's March. In fact, St. Patty's Day is just a couple days away, and we can see the remnants of the ice pack that had grown on the Connecticut River this year, which is pretty interesting to see. It's kind of a cold winter, not as cold as they used to be. And right on the other side of the river, the mother city of West Springfield, the city of home, Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, from the south, we can see a hill right here. And on that hill, the Agawam native people built a stockade in 1638, shortly after Pension was given permission to settle and then asked to go to the east side of the river. The native people told Pension that the west side of the river tended to flood, to beware of that side of the river, and he didn't leave because he wanted to. They also told him to please do that as their crops were being raided by his domesticated animals like cattle and sheep and pigs. And so Pension establishes his city with the center right where you see the white church steeple to the far right of the cluster of larger buildings. That big steeple there is the Campanile. And the first church for the Springfield colony was built right there. The early Springfield colony was a small one. With only around 40 families, each owning long plots on the east side of the river. Interspersed, these are vegetable plots and grazing plots. That's what that side of the river was particularly good for. And over here on the west side of the river, they also had plots, the same families. And over here, it was originally garden plots, and that's because the soil, you can see it's rich black dirt over here, because the west side tends to flood, and woodlots. And there weren't a lot of trees growing in the Pioneer Valley at the time. That's why we have so many fields in the toponyms of the cities around here. Westfield, Greenfield, Deerfield, go down the river, Hatfield, fields all over, Suffield, right, all the way down into Connecticut. Because the native people used agricultural techniques that we would call slash and burn today. Well, the early colony had its ups and downs, and two of the big moments would have been the witch trial of Hugh and Mary Parsons, which we'll bring you an episode on specifically, and then King Philip's War, when the native people who lived on that hill descended upon Springfield and burned all but 3 of the homes in the city, all the barns, killed most of the animals. The city of Springfield only survived because of aid sent west by the eastern unaffected cities. And then there's an event that happens shortly after King Philip's War ends. In fact, 8 years later. An event that involved a couple of characters who would have witnessed the burning of the city of Springfield. In fact, the main character in the story, Bodurtha, his first wife, Blanche, gotta love that, Blanche, was a witness against Hugh and Mary Parsons in Massachusetts' first witchcraft trial. Well, he's now married again after her passing, and he had a son, John, who had been involved in the attack on Turner's Falls, or Peskiumscut as it was called, in May of 1676. The last great battle in this area. There's a boat on the river over there. Look at that. Somebody's out there having a good time. Well, let's get to the story. In 1683, young Mercy Bodurtha, the daughter of Reese's son John and his daughter-in-law Lydia, unexpectedly died a week after birth of some kind of childhood ailment, and there were many. And the father needed to bring the body across the river to the first church to have the minister at the time revoke her baptism, or what you would call give her her last rites. At the time that this occurs, the Connecticut River is a major boundary between the eastern portion of the Springfield colony and the western portion. People had begun moving to the west side of the river to establish homes in the 1650s, late, as the Springfield colony grew and sent off offshoots like Northampton, Hadley, Hatfield, ultimately Squawkyag and Deerfield. So there were families living on the west side of the river, and the Bodurthas were one. And when Mercy passed in March of that year, she would be returned across the river, and they used a boat to do so. Now imagine what it was like in 1683 when Massachusetts didn't have the kind of freedom of religion that you think of today. In those days, the New England Way meant that the government and the church were intimately connected, and one of the great rules of the Springfield colony was not breaking the Sabbath. People that lived on the west side of the river had to get in boats every Sunday and cross this river regardless of the state of the river, whether it was in a flood or whether we were in a real low river pool because of a drought. They had to cross, rain, snow, sleet, and hail. And in the case of the 1683 crossing by Reese and John, Lydia and Mercy's body, assisted by a couple of neighbors rowing the sweeps, was that this river was filled with chunks of ice as it had begun breaking up north. Now in the wintertime you could walk across the river, it would freeze that hard. But in March, because of the rains, we'd get ice off and break up, and these ice cakes are floating down the river. And as the family head across the river to bring Mercy's body back, a disaster occurred. Somehow the boat overturned. Was it ice that did it? Was it someone at the sweeps, maybe an obstacle? If you come to the Connecticut River, you can see the hunk of floating tree right here. During the spring, if you pay attention, you'll see entire trees floating down the Connecticut River, creating snags like the one right down there. Could be that they encountered a snag, a deadhead, meaning a log that was underwater, and they caught on it. But the vessel that they were in tipped over. Reese, John, Lydia will all go into the river, and they'll all drown. West Springfield residents, and that was part of Springfield at the time, are extremely concerned, and they had been telling the fathers of the city of Springfield, it's now a new crop, most of them from the original colony had passed on, but we need a parish church on the west side of the river. Now people lived on the west side of the river from all the way up into what we now call Holyoke, all the way down over the Westfield River on this side to what we now call Agawam. And these people all were forced to cross the river every single Sunday to go to church. So, ultimately, they appealed to the state general court. We can't be asked to continue to cross this dangerous river. Look what happened to the Bodurthas. As a result, the general court, that's what we call our legislative body out east in Boston, the general court, we still call it that today in Massachusetts. They deliberated, and they deliberated, And they deliberated some more. And after 10 years of deliberation, they decided that West Springfield ought to have its own parish. Thus, if we look at that first congregational church, even though it's a new one, we see date of incorporation 1698. It took 5 years for the people of West Springfield to raise the money and build the church, and in 1698, which is 15 years after the Bodurtha tragedy, we see West Springfield on its way to severance with the city of Springfield. With the information I've just told you, West Springfield is on its way to becoming an independent community. But that wouldn't happen for some years. And let me give you a little bit of foreshadowing of what it was like living in West Springfield, even with their own parish. They didn't have to cross the river anymore to go to church. But do you know how people paid taxes back in those days? Your taxes were paid by work days on your town's roads, your community's roads. And so the people in West Springfield who are breaking the west side of the river, Agawam, Feeding Hills, West Springfield, Holyoke, they're breaking the land. They're putting in roads. They're putting in little bridges and culverts and diverting water on come-alongs. They're doing all the things they're doing. They'd be assessed 4 of their 6 days working on developing the east side of the river's road system. This was outrageous. Ultimately, the issue wouldn't be resolved until just before the American Revolution, when there were enough people living on the west side of the river to outnumber those living on the east. And they then voted in the annual town meeting, which takes place in May, to require that the following year's town meeting be held on the west side of the river, so that the wonderful fathers of the city of Springfield would have to make the crossing. Gulp. That was when the city of Springfield agreed to allow West Springfield to petition the state to become its own community. But that's a whole different story we'll get to another time. And it's cool taking a look at the city of Homes with the Memorial Bridge. And imagine when all that wasn't there, and it was just a series of farmhouses set back about as far away as you can see Route 91 moving north and south. That's where the houses would have been, on the higher ground, with gardens coming down to the river, long lots, and they would have extended all the way down toward the foot of the hill there. Last one would have probably been right in here. In fact, Hugh and Mary Parsons' property was right here where I'm pointing at that brick building that you might see.